Good evening and hello from Hove, St. Peter's. I'm Father Alexander. We're taking another step in our walking tour through the Bible. And I just want to stop at Genesis 22, which is the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, I said the story of Lot and his daughters was probably the most unpleasant story in the Old Testament. Indeed, it's an unpleasant story, full stop. The chapter 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, is not just unpleasant in many of its aspects, but it's deeply problematic. It's almost disturbing. There's a very famous picture of the sacrifice of Isaac done by Caravaggio. If you just put in sacrifice of Isaac and Caravaggio, out it will pop. And it shows Isaac bound and waiting for, and Abraham stretching out his hand to slay the boy, and the boy is absolutely terrified. The look on his face is one of sheer terror, and God, the angel, is putting out his hand to stay the hand of Abraham. It's, if you like, in one picture the whole story, which is chapter 22. If you just want to have a look at chapter 22, you can do so now. Okay, if you had a look at chapter 22, what on earth is all this about? God said, take your son, your only son, the beloved son that you were promised, your only chance of having legitimate descendants, your beloved Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, where you are to offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I shall point out to you. So God appears to Abraham as he's appeared many times, and he says, go and sacrifice your son, offer your son up as a burnt offering. And early next morning, in other words, with some alacrity, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. And they go off to this distant mountain, the mountain of Moriah. He leaves the servants behind, saying, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I are going over there. We shall worship and then come back to you. Except, of course, terrible irony, they're not going to come back. Only the father will come back. The boy, by that time, will be dead and burnt. So it is a story laden with tragedy and with irony and with horror, as a matter of fact, because this is a horror story, chronicle of a death foretold. And so they go ahead a little way. He's got the wood for the burnt offering, which he loads on Isaac, something which, of course, going up a mountain, something which, of course, future commentators, Christian commentators, will take to be a type of Christ, loaded with the wood of the cross, climbing Mount Calvary for the remission of the world's sins. And they also have the fire and the knife. But the boy says, Father, yes, my son, look, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? My son, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And the two of them went on together. Well, it's true, God is going to provide the lamb, but not quite in the way that Abraham intends. Abraham means you are the lamb that is provided by God. You are standing in for the lamb. In other words, he can't bear to tell his son that his son is going to be sacrificed. Well, then we know what happens just as he's about to sacrifice the boy. He does blindfold the boy, incidentally. He's about to sacrifice a boy. He bound his son and put him on the altar on top of the wood. Actually, I'm wrong. There's no mention of a blindfold, whatever. Stretched out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. So the boy's tied up on an altar on a pile of wood. What was going through the boy's head as this was going on? Did the boy struggle? It's a horrible story. I think you'll agree with me. It's a horrible story. And then God says, Abraham, Abraham, here I am. Do not raise your hand against the boy, for now I know you fear God. And then, of course, there is a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice of a ram whose horns are caught in a thorn bush. So God does provide an animal for the sacrifice. It's not the son. I don't know how I do know how we're to interpret this. There is a very negative interpretation you can take, which is that God is some sort of sadist, and he's putting Abraham to the test. He's tempting Abraham to do something absolutely appalling, killing his own son for God, and then right at the last moment dragging him back from the edge of the precipice. And this would be giving us a picture of God who is very manipulative, very unkind, very cruel, whose power is shown in manipulation, cruelty, and unkindness. Alternatively, we could take this as a sort of parable, and a and a parable teaches us something. What's it teaching? Well, it's teaching us this. Throughout the Middle East at that time, people sacrificed their firstborn children to the gods. This was the custom right up to, well, more or less the time of, just before the time of Jesus, certainly throughout the time of the kings, certainly up time through the time of the prophets. In the cities of the plain, that's to say, the Philistines, amongst the Philistines, but above all amongst the Phoenicians and amongst the Canaanites, there was this idea that to give thanks to God or to propitiate the anger of God, you had to give him the firstborn. Now, the Egyptians did practice the sacrifice of the firstborn, namely of the firstborn lamb or the firstborn ram, the firstborn goat. That is to say, when an animal produced for the first time, that the offspring of the animal was sacrificed to the Lord in thanksgiving. Then, of course, the animal would go on to produce more things. As for the firstborn you shall redeem. It's what you're told in the book of the law. So while other people were sacrificing the firstborn were not to be sacrificed, the firstborn sons. So in other words, it's a dramatization of the difference between the people of Canaan, the peoples around Abraham, and the customs of Abraham's descendants. The firstborn son is not to be sacrificed to God. Firstborn son is to be redeemed. Something will be sacrificed in his place. Firstborn son belongs to God. Of course, then we've got the overshadowing this entire episode. We've got the question of what happens on Mount Calvary. Mount Moriah is supposed to be Mount Zion, i.e. Jerusalem. So this is the site, more or less, of the temple and, of course, of the greatest sacrifice of all, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. But there's a big difference here. Jesus was not sacrificed by his Father. Jesus sacrificed himself to the Father, offering himself to the Father for our sins. In other words, Jesus, as we say in the Eucharistic prayer, he freely gave himself over to death for our sake. He wasn't forced to do this, as obviously the boy Isaac is, because the boy Isaac is tied up. Jesus was not tied up in the sense that he gave himself freely to be put to death. He was not physically, he was physically restrained, but he himself happily gave himself up for our salvation, whereas Isaac does not happily give himself up for our salvation, as far as we know. The other thing about this story, which certainly would make out that it is some sort of parable, is we don't get any indication afterwards that Isaac is scarred for life by this, that somehow or another this is a traumatic childhood experience. Isaac is tied up. He's a boy. He can speak. He can walk. He can carry wood. So he's old enough to know what's happening. But he is not traumatized for life in the subsequent stories about Isaac. So it is, if you like, a sort of parable rather than something that happened in, how can we put this, in real life, I think. It happened in the sense that God instructed his people by vivid means through this passage, you are not to sacrifice your sons. But whether Abraham learnt this lesson, not to sacrifice his son, just as he was about to do so, remains unclear. I think it's probably not the case. But one thing is certain, that we do not believe in human sacrifice. Nobody can, I think, ever tar us with that brush. We as Christians do not believe in human sacrifice, and our Jewish brethren did not believe in human sacrifice from the beginning, from the time of Abraham. Abraham sacrifices animals. He never, ever sacrifices anything else, any living human being. All the best. Hope I've tried to explain that as best I can. It's a difficult passage, isn't it?